Is my mic working? Yes, it is. Okay.
So, you working? How you been?
I've been pretty good, but you know, it's a little bit weird thinking that you know, at the end of this series, I am going to be the voice of males.
Well, better you than me. At this point. You want to just jump in? Let's start by talking about this first story in your new collection. Here's the new collection. I'll hold it up. Trajectory. Kind of a nice cover there with a bullseye. The first story in this collection is called Horsemen, and it's a story, among other things, about a woman named Janet Moore, a literature professor, a woman who was told years and years ago by one of her heroes that as good as her scholarly work is, it's still missing something. One last piece of the puzzle, a thing that, over the course of the story, she comes to understand is a sense of passion for the work she does. It's the greatest of mysteries, she's told by her mentor. What it's like to be another person, what it feels like, I mean. Life, literature, they give us little glimpses, leaving us hungry for more. So there's a lot to think about there. But I guess my first question is whether you think that's at the heart of why you write, your desire to know what it's like to be another person.
I mean, it's absolutely at the center of it. When I was a graduate student back in the day at the University of Arizona, I actually did before my MFA work, as you know. But I did before I ever wrote my first story. I had done almost a complete PhD in American literature, and I had already begun my dissertation. And I wouldn't say that it's necessarily like this for all people, but you know, during that many years, this was during Vietnam, so we all stayed in as long as we could. So I was in the graduate program at the University of Arizona for like a decade. There are now rules in place there that prevent anything like that from ever happening again, and they're due to me. But during that
Russo problem.
That's right. But during that time, undergraduate, the undergraduate time, and then I did an MA and a PhD. And all that time that I was studying literature, I think it was enormously valuable to me. And what I learned from reading Twain and Dickens and so many other writers is visible in my work. So it's not like that I wasn't learning anything during that period of time when I was studying the work of other great writers. I was learning something by osmosis. But when I started writing fiction, that was when I was forced, I think, to do exactly what you're talking about. Imagine the life of another person across age, across gender, across race and ethnicity, across class, and it's to do that is to not just understand empathy intellectually. It's to put it kind of in play, moral imagination.
But the question is, how do we know if we've succeeded? Because I know that certainly in Long Black Veil, in the new suspense book, and other books I've written as well, I come to the work in the hopes of getting out of myself.
Yes.
And yet I look at, so here's a book with six. It's an ensemble cast, at least at the beginning, of 6 young people who all get locked behind the walls of an abandoned prison. In fact, when they're about, I think they're right out of college. They're like 22-year-olds.
Yeah.
And they get locked behind the walls of this prison, and they get locked in, and then they quickly find out that they're not alone, and something bad happens, and so. And
it's a lovely device too, by the way. It's not this prison, which is kind of the beginning of Jenny's novel, is it's so vividly described, and it becomes almost like a character. It becomes almost like a character in the book. But the great joy, of course, is that it also becomes a metaphor for so many of the characters in the book and what they're struggling with. And you've done that before in fiction. This locking people up and seeing what they do.
Right. Well, I want to get back. I want to get back to prisons in a second.
Yeah.
But the question, when I wrote those 6 people,
right?
To me, they were all really, really different. But
yeah.
I think I know a couple people who've read the book so far have said, they're kind of all you. And so I think for a lot of writers, that's the great fear, is that as much as we try to get out of ourselves, it's still a puppet show.
Yeah. Well, to go back to your original question, how do you know whether you've succeeded or not? It's very simple. I'm telling you, you succeeded.
Okay, thanks, Rick.
Good job. Oh. no, but
get on, Russo.
No, but it's that's the great paradox, isn't it? Is that. And I think we probably have some actors in the audience here. I can't see anyone, so I'm just guessing. But I've known a few actors who have talked about this, and what they're in it for, it seems to me, is to do exactly what we've been talking about, to get out of themselves. But before they can do that, every actor that I've ever spoken to about this has said, in order to do that, in order to get out of myself and portray this fictional character in the script, I have to find something in myself to explain them. I have to find some sort of emotional, behavioral link. So that's the paradox.
Well, I think, people come.
In order to be somebody else, I have to find them in me.
Right.
So of course, all 6 people are you. Of course they are.
But then of course, our readers think that we are those people as well. Even in memoir, I think of so many people have come up to me, people come up to me as if I were the person who is the voice of that memoir, which of course you'd think. It is a memoir, after all.
Yeah.
And yet it's also a constructed self.
Yeah.
I might not be.
Do you get as pissed off as I do when they do it?
No one gets
No one gets as pissed off as I do.
You're making me think of a night. Well, I spent one evening at some crazy banquet, and by wonderful, miraculous luck, my dinner partner was Sir Ian McKellen. Right. So I was here, and Ian McKellen was there, and the interesting thing is they kept bringing out these glasses of vodka like this, and a chaser of orange juice. And one thing I've learned: never try to keep up with an English stage actor when it comes to drinking.
No,
because it was just down the hatch. But I was so thrilled to be next to him because, of course, I was with Gandalf.
Yeah.
And so the whole night, I remember he made these two. The only thing I remember now in the blur is he made these 2 sounds. One of which was blah 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 blah, and the other was blah 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 blah.
Yep.
Well, I spent the whole night with him like he was.
I've seen all three of those Lord of the Rings, and I think you've got him nailed.
But I spent the evening so excited because I was with the characters that he played.
Yeah, sure.
And I kept trying to get to the person in there.
Yeah.
But I couldn't quite get there. So.
And but that's probably because you had already met Sir Ian McKellen so many times in so many films. The best that he had to offer you, he'd already given you, I think, in those parts, just as we in our books, I think, have already given our audiences the very best that we have to offer. And lovely as it is, when I go out on the road and when you go out on the road too, as wonderful as it is to talk with people with whom our books, to whom our books mean something. I'm always very conscious of the fact that the best that I have to offer is in these things, not now.
Right.
It's the best that we have is already there, and I always imagine people going out afterwards and saying, "Well, geez, that was disappointing, wasn't it?" I thought he was smarter than I thought he was smarter than that.
Well, they don't know you as well as I. I'm thinking about your collection. Yours is a collection of short stories. Mine is a novel. There are characters in each of these two books that could have a very cool conversation, because I think many of your characters and the characters in Long Black Veil are people who have somehow never quite become themselves. Janet Moore, the academic in the first story I was talking about, is missing a sense of passion, and her story even opens with her catching a boy red-handed in plagiarism, and the sense of someone who would steal someone else's work, someone else's soul. She says, or you have her say at a certain point, she worries that if she read her own work, her younger work, she would understand something is missing, that there is an absence in them, an implied writer, a ghost. And it's like her teacher is telling her, it's like you don't exist. And she tells her teacher, but I do exist, which, of course, has to be the saddest thing one person ever has to convince another person of. Which, to me, raises the question of what do you think keeps people from becoming themselves? What turns people into ghosts?
Well, in the case of Janet Moore, I think there is often that sense that people have, and Janet certainly has, that there's what they want in their heart of hearts, but then there's what other people maybe expect of them in some way, or what the world expects of them in some way. Janet in this story has kind of, to my mind, kind of a heartbreaking memory of when she was in graduate school. She used to be a singer in her boyfriend's band, and she was good, and she would get up on the table and sing, and that's what she wanted. There was some singer in her somewhere, but she wanted to be taken seriously. And I think she was a driven young woman at a time when women were beginning to take themselves more seriously and find other things to do with their lives. And I think she kind of did what other people expected of her. She had a certain facility for it, but ended up not singing that song that she wanted to sing.
Right, which I believe was Somebody to Love.
Somebody to
old
love,
Jefferson
yeah. When the truth is found to be lies, yeah.
The idea of people never quite becoming themselves is one, obviously, that haunts me. And as a transgender person, it's something that was, for me, it was kind of the dilemma of, well, if I become my true self, I'll become someone that the people that I love might no longer recognize.
Right.
And I might also, if I live this authentic life, I might my life might become very, very hard. I might be in danger. I might lose my family. I might lose my job. I might be on the receiving end of violence. I might wind up homeless. I mean, the lives of transgender people are obviously can be scary and grim. And I was saved from that fate in part because I had the love of my family, of Dee Dee and my sons, but also of my friends. But
and friendship always plays such an important role. Long before I came on the scene, friendship was playing a role in your fiction, and to the point of how you find your true self. I remember, it's the Constellations, isn't it, where a bunch of friends get trapped in a gigantic in a heart, in a human heart.
It's in the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia.
In Philadelphia.
Yeah, which has a giant
mechanical heart.
Yeah, and you walk through, you follow the course of the blood. If you've been
Right.
to Philadelphia, I wish I made this up, but it's a real thing.
Yeah.
I think something something bad happens in the heart.
Yeah, but that's
Let's think about this symbol.
So at least and in this most recent book you have this prison structure where you put a bunch of friends, and in that earlier book from a couple decades ago you have a bunch of friends trapped in a mechanical heart, and you have the sense in reading that book that if they're ever going to find themselves, they're going to find themselves in there and not out in the wider world. That they have come to the heart of the matter. In that. So you've been doing this a while, and we do this, don't we?
Forgot about that book.
We come back to these. We come back to some of the central metaphors of our lives, don't we? In book after book.
Do you think you can revisit what you were thinking when I came out as trans, and what you were, it was pretty rough on you, if I recall. I mean, I know you're a word for me, but I think you're a word for you too.
Well, that's. Some of you in the audience may know that I had the honor to write the afterword to Jenny's first memoir about her transition, and I kind of try. That's what I tried to do in that was to suggest in that the prince that there was the shock of the revelation, which I certainly wasn't expecting anything like that, and I think I was just
which
kind
to
of
me was insane, because I was like, how could people not have seen
how can
I've been here the whole time.
Yeah, and
it's
and
weird.
I didn't, and nobody.
Well, nobody
did.
did. Nobody did.
Yeah, I didn't, and nobody did. So there was the shock of the first day, and Barbara was away at the time. My wife Barbara was away at the time, and when I went to pick her up at the airport, and we drove back, picked her up at the Portland airport. We were living up the coast at the time. Yes, that's right. We were living in Camden at the time. We were living up the coast, and we got on I-95. And when you leave Portland on I-95, once you're outside of the lights of Portland, it becomes dark really quickly.
Didi calls that the road to nowhere.
Yeah. And I remember sitting in the car with Barbara, and I had turned the music. We had the music on, and I had turned it down, and I had told myself I wasn't going to say anything to her until we were away from Portland. There was no traffic. It was dark, and so I turned the music down. And the first thing that I said to Barbara was, "There's something that I have to talk with you about tonight, and I just want you to know that this is not about us." Because I didn't want to terrify her, because usually when somebody says there's something
we need to talk about.
Something we need to talk about, that's usually not it's usually not a good thing. And I wanted her to know that by saying this is not about us, what I was trying to say is we're not getting divorced. I haven't fallen in love with someone else. All of those things that I haven't been diagnosed. Any of those things that you would normally first go to. But I realized as soon as I said this is not about us, which is another way of saying it's not about me, it's not about you. I realized as soon as the words were out of my mouth that it was a lie, because it was about us, because what you had confided to me was so intimate, and your trust in me to receive it was such. And telling it to Barbara, because this is about the ways in which we think we know people, and I could not tell my wife this is not about us, because what I was telling her is that there is a sacred, very private place in each of us that we keep sacred and we keep private. And when it suddenly comes out, it alters the world. It had already altered your world, and in that day, it had altered mine, because I realized that there was something at your my dear friend, there was something at your core that I didn't understand, and I was about to pass that on to my wife, who was going to think, well, if we don't really, I mean, if people have that kind of level of secrecy, if there are things like that we don't know, then really, what can any of us know about each other? And I could see her, even though it was dark in the car, I could see her looking at me and thinking, well, all right, now what do we know about each other? What do we know about the world? We're just going on blindly here? I mean, the whole world gets tipped, doesn't it? And that's what I was feeling, was that the world of the day before you told me that was not the same as the world today.
And
it wasn't just you.
In a way that had nothing to do with gender.
Yes.
And everything to do with the difficulty of knowing another soul, including the people that you love the most.
Yes.
There's a story in your new collection called Voice, which is about, among other things, male friendship. Actually, there's a couple stories. Interventions is the third story in the collection, is also, among other things, about male friendship, brotherhood, and competition. And Nate, the hero of the story called Voice, is in Venice with his estranged brother in the wake of a scandal back on the campus where he taught. It makes me wonder, do you think that that's often the nature of male friendship, a kind of competition?
Probably. And I would... It's so difficult for me to speak for males. I've kind of never been a guy's guy.
But you're pegged that way as a writer. Is that frustrating for you? I mean, you're like the hard-bitten, blue-collar voice of Gloversville, New York.
That's just because I'm writing about my father. Any notions I have of what it means to be a man.
Well, tell us about.
Well, it's interesting. My father was kind of a guy's guy. He did hard physical labor all of his life. He was a war hero, and I think that he never had any ambivalent feelings about his gender. He never had any ambivalent feelings about what he was supposed to do as a man. And so when I was a young man and trying to figure out how to be a man, and what that might even entail, I was always trying to measure up to him in a way, and yet he had left us, because when I was growing up, my parents separated when I was young, and so on the one hand, here's a guy that went from Normandy through France all the way to Berlin, came back, lived a kind of guy's life of boozing and all of that. And I remember being on the road with him when we would go out and after 11 days working road construction. And we would go out drinking beer, and when you buy a round of beer, everybody gets a beer, and by the end of the night, I'd have 6 bottles of beer lined up in front of me, and he would be done. All the other guys would be done, and I knew I couldn't be my father's son in that respect. And yet, when I got married and you start having kids, then you better figure out what being a man means to you. And in some ways, then I had to say, all right, well, what do I want to? What kind of a man do I want to be? And the kind of man that I wanted to be was one who was present. I just wanted to be there. I didn't have any real sense that I would be very good as a father. I was glad to have daughters. I know that. I was very glad to have daughters, because if you're a man who's not quite sure what it means to be a man, you can be forgiven for not understanding women. So I was glad to have. I was really glad to have daughters. My ignorance was covered. But I really had only. So I didn't think I was going to be a good father, but I knew the one thing I was going to be is I was going to be around. So I've never been that competitive. with male friends, and my sense now of in the latter part of my life, as you said, all of my the people who've meant the most to me in my life, so many of them are women. And raising two daughters, one of the things that I have been worried about is just how competitive women are, and it's a subject that doesn't get talked about quite as much as male competitiveness.
Yeah, I think I was more competitive with you back in the day, as we referred to that time. When we first met, we each had 2 books. Our second book, we had the same publisher, and in fact, the same editor, Marty Ashler at Vintage.
That's right.
And I remember when you won the Pulitzer, I kind of took it as a personal. It was a thing that you'd done to me.
Well, that's how I meant it.
You went out of your way to hurt my feelings.
Well, I see, message received. I had no idea you understood all that.
But of course, you could say our careers have kind of gone in different directions. By the way, if you want to do the whole transgender memoirs thing, believe it's not too early, or it's not too late for us to see how that works out for you. Rick did actually, in fact, I don't talk about the surgery part of my transition very often because, for one, I'm afraid people will think it's gross, and 2, because I'm afraid that the transgender people's stories are so often reduced to stories about operations, and it's just undignified. But so I haven't told the story before. But when we went out to Wisconsin for the old Presto Changeo, which I was so happy to have that. I was so delighted to have. But of course, my wife Dee Dee was with me, and Dee Dee was there to look out for me. Mm-hmm. But also, Rick Russo came to look out for Dee Dee. So I kind of had my team, and we all took the same plane, and there was some question like you were going to get to the airport before us, and that we were afraid we were going to meet at the airport, and I remember you said, "I'm not going to Wisconsin unless you guys show up first," because you were afraid that you got off the plane and they might grab you.
That's right.
And which I had a whole idea. Yeah, that was my little plan, in fact. And you'd be like, "No, I'm really Richard Russo, novelist."
Yeah, well, they do sometimes amputate the wrong leg, don't they, in these hospitals?
Oh my God. Yeah. Well, I think we've now reached the gutter. How long did that take? It's 20 of. I have this plan. What happened if we each gave a short reading from the new book,
okay,
and then we turn to the audience and entertain questions, or else evade them in an entertaining way.
Okay.
You want to read us something from Trajectory?
Sure.
All right. What are you going to read?
All right. I'm just going to read a short scene from a story called Intervention. The main character here, like a lot of the characters in these stories, has found himself at a time in his life where his own behavior has become inexplicable to him. And he's about to discover that the only way to figure out why he's behaving the way he is in time present is to revisit some things in the past. Half an hour later, showered and dressed, Ray pulled into the driveway. Oh, nope, wrong start. Here we go.
You want to read mine?
Nope, yeah, that's right. The following morning, Ray was startled awake by a car horn, half a dozen loud, angry blasts, as an unseen vehicle roared by the house and up the street. And for the second time in the last 24 hours, he thought of his long-forgotten Uncle Jack. Tall and thin, hungry-looking he seemed to Ray. Jack was straight-haired, loose-limbed, and handsome, a contrast to their father, who was several inches shorter and thicker, his face dimpled, attractively, Ray thought at the time, from a childhood disease, his hair an unruly bird's nest. Even when he wasn't working in the mill, Ray's father always dressed in rugged work pants, coarse gray shirts with dual breast pockets, and ankle-high steel-toed boots, whereas his brother wore sharply creased slacks, white button-down shirts, and shiny black shoes. Looking at the two men, you would conclude that Uncle Jack was the more prosperous, but apparently he owed everybody. Though he lived in downtown Skowhegan, Ray and his brother Bill rarely saw their uncle, whose visits were as dramatic as they were unexpected. Their purpose was always the same: to get their father to invest in one of Jack's many schemes, each pitched as an investment opportunity of a lifetime. Their father always listened politely, without comment, as if to the radio. No need to look at it either. While his brother explained how this new deal worked, how it would make them both rich, how for a small outlay of funds today would put him on the ground floor tomorrow. Hell, in a matter of months, he'd be able to quit his sucker job at the mill and be his own boss for once. Their uncle's cadences rose and fell in great waves. And at various points, Ray would think that he was winding down, but then he'd remember something else. Hey, wait, I almost forgot the best part. Eventually, though, it was impossible to ignore his siblings' lack of visible interest. And he would say, "So, what do you think, big brother?" What Ray's father invariably thought, or at least said, was that no, he didn't think he was interested. Did he want to think it over? No, that wouldn't be necessary. So his answer was final? Yes, it was. What was so perplexing was not that his father declined, he always did, but that he offered his brother so little in return for his wonderful enthusiasm. After all, it took Uncle Jack a good half hour or more to detail how great this idea was, how you couldn't lose, really, if you thought about it. If their father had misgivings, small or large, why not express them? Or at the very least, offer some general excuse. Why not tell his brother that he was sorry, but he just didn't have the money? How would Uncle Jack, who never had any himself, how would he have known any better? Or he could have reminded his brother that he wasn't a bachelor, that he had a wife and 2 young boys to think about and couldn't risk what little they had on an adventure, no matter how tempting. Instead, unless Ray's memory was playing him false, the impression that his father conveyed was that, yes, he did have the money. He just wasn't going to give any of it to his brother. His refusal to say why could only mean one thing: that Uncle Jack was himself the reason. Well, their uncle hadn't been the kind of man to take such rejection lying down, and this was where the drama came in. Nearly 5 years after hearing the last one, Ray could still almost verbatim the various tirades that their father's cool rebuffs always occasioned. What is it with you, Tommy? You like standing in lines? You like waiting for someone to decide what your share is? Because while you're standing out front with the schmucks waiting for scraps, the smart people are slipping in the back and taking what's theirs. You were in the army, for God's sake. You saw how things work. You know what this country we fought for is all about. It's the land of backdoors and secret handshakes. People didn't stop drinking during Prohibition. They just stopped going in through the front. Another time, Uncle Jack had grabbed the phone book and shaken it in his brother's face. You know what's in here, Tommy? It's the numbers they want dummies like you to know about. All the important ones are unlisted, There's two kinds of people in the world, big brother, the ones who know the unlisted numbers and the ones who don't. You know what they call the ones who don't know those numbers? Chumps, Tommy. Your average chump spends his life wondering why his luck never changes. See, that's what makes him a chump. He thinks it's luck. But here's the thing. If somebody gave your average chump an unlisted number, he'd write it down. He'd call it. Maybe he might be a chump, but he's not a complete moron. You're no average chump, Tommy. No, sir. There's nothing average about you. Somebody comes along and lets you in on the score, offers you the unlisted number. You say, no thanks, I'll just stand here in line with the other chumps. At this point, he dropped the phone book in their father's lap. When you want something, you consult your damn phone book. Much as Ray and his brother Bill enjoyed their uncle's riffs, it was his thrilling dismounts that they really looked forward to. He always blew out of the house violently, as if on a gust of wind, the door slamming so hard their mother's figurines leapt on the shelf. Outside, he'd take the porch steps in a wild, imprudent leap, one time hitting an icy patch at the bottom and ending up on his ass. Turning his key in the ignition of whatever beater he happened just then to be driving, he would rev the engine until it screamed and then pop the vehicle in gear and lurch away from the curb on squealing tires, leaning on the horn all the way down the street as if each blast were yet another insult. Except, of course, for the last time. What on earth had caused their father to explode that day? When he'd always been so unflappable before. It had been August, Ray recalled, so maybe the heat? They'd all been out on the porch, Ray and his brother, their father and uncle, all four of them drinking tall glasses of their mother's fresh squeezed lemonade. As usual, Uncle Jack was holding forth about how rich they would be, how you'd have to be blind not to see how much moolah. That was one of their uncle's favorite words. Moolah was waiting out there to be made. And also, as usual, his father had said, no, he didn't think he was interested. And was promptly called a fool and asked, rhetorically, Ray now understood, what the hell was wrong with him? Did he like slaving away at the mill for peanuts? Here, though, came a memory glitch. Everything fast-forwarding until Uncle Jack was sprawled flat on his back and their father, who had come flying out of his chair on top of him, pummeling him with his fists and grunting, shut up, shut up, shut up. The word shut timed to the impact of his right fist and up to his left. Their mother, who had been in the kitchen when it started, was suddenly there on the porch. For some reason, Ray remembered the faded floral pattern of the dress that she was wearing, screaming at their father to stop, stop, please stop, you're killing him. Neither Ray nor his brother Bill had ever seen their father disobey a direct command of hers, but now he just kept punching as if he were too far away to hear her pleading. He stopped only when Uncle Jack went limp, his eyes rolling back in their sockets. Had there really been as much blood as Ray remembered? There must have been, because Ray recalled feeling so lightheaded that he thought he might faint. This, he also thought, this torn skin and leaking blood was what their mother didn't want them to see when dogs fought in the street, and why sometimes she turned off the evening news.
Yay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rick. Okay, my turn. Here's a scene early on in Long Black Veil. And here's a character whose name is Rachel, and she is not unlike that character you're talking about, who has never never quite become herself, who never became the singer. This character is never quite, she's a professor of art history, but she never became the painter she wanted to be. She also has two ex-boyfriends, Quentin, who has died, and an ex-boyfriend whose name is Backflip Bob. She's in the Philadelphia Art Museum, and she's looking at the portrait of Leonardo's John the Baptist. In the Louvre, the painting lived in a long gallery just outside the crowded chamber where the Mona Lisa hung. A few tourists paused beside it or took a photograph with their cell phones. There were, sometimes, a few people gathered around it, but this was nothing compared to the hundreds squeezed around the Mona Lisa, a painting that, its smile notwithstanding, Rachel thought of as not as Leonardo's best work. John the Baptist was the last painting he'd painted, and it was hard at this date to understand how scandalous it once had been. But John was traditionally depicted as a wild-eyed, locust-eating prophet, and there were more than a few medieval paintings that presented John as just this side of a raving lunatic. But instead, here was Leonardo's version, a gentle, androgynous figure, his soft lips and sexy ringlets drawing the viewer close, his face full of forgiveness and love. Whatever this world is, the saint implored, its heartache shall be quelled. He pointed toward the heavens to urge us toward the kingdom of God, but his other hand was on his heart, as if to show that the wonder of that kingdom lived within all of us as well. Love will prevail, John said, and make us both men and women, darkness and light. Oh, John the Bee, she thought, you sexy hound dog. There's just no quenching you. It was the mouth that had attracted the most attention over the years. It was the same mouth he'd given the Mona Lisa, that tight-lipped, mystifying beam. But for Rachel, the haunting thing about John's face was the dark, soft eyes, the long, curling hair. It was hard to repress the desire to want to reach out and run one's fingers through it. It was such a beautiful face, she thought. The forgiveness and the love that radiated out of it was confounding and humbling. And yet, for all that, the man in the painting was not some otherworldly, avenging Messiah like the Renaissance Jesus. John had no halo. He was a human. The look on his face said, I'm like you. But he'd been transformed through surrender. Love came to him through that upraised finger, as if he were a lightning rod for all the compassion in the universe. Its voltage coursed through him and came out through the fingers of the other hand and consumed his heart. He looked out at Rachel with his deep, forgiving eyes and said, this is the world we have been given, a world in which all we know and all we have is love. Standing there alone in the chamber with him, something caught in Rachel's throat, and she cried out loud. For a moment she staggered, raised one hand to her temple. She said softly, I can't. John the Baptist just looked at her with his soft, divine smile. Hey, of course you can, he said. She turned from the painting and walked out of the room. A guard came toward her. Is everything all right, Professor? She nodded, unable to speak, her eyes moist. We're opening to the public in about 5 minutes, said the guard. Okay, she said, and walked swiftly down the hall and into the ladies' room. She ran some water in the sink and let it fill her cupped fingers. Then she raised the water to her face. Rachel dried off, tried to shake off some of the emotions that had engulfed her. She looked in the mirror. There she was, 57 years old, her hair still long and curly, but now nearly all gray. She wore no makeup. Rachel wasn't even sure she still owned any makeup, although she suspected there might have been a 10-year-old tube of mascara in the back of one of the drawers in her apartment across from the campus. Her life over the years had attained a simplicity that gave her peace. She'd largely given up dating, owned an old Subaru that spent most of its days in her driveway. She planted flowers in her window boxes, put birdseed in her feeder, watched the black-capped chickadees and the finches as they landed and fed and flew. Now she was feeling a little bit embarrassed about her emotional reaction to St. John. What was that about? There had been something intimidating about the man, as if he were asking her questions he had no right to ask. Really, John the Bee, she thought. There was no reason to be rude. "What can I tell you, Rachel?" the saint replied. "If you're not going to hear it from me, then who? Come on. I'm one of your oldest friends. You need the people who love you once in a while to tell you the truth." Yeah, she thought, well, I don't know about that, Johnny B. People always say that, "I'm just telling you the truth," like they have some access to the truth that eludes other mortals. Over the years, she'd known lots and lots of people who styled themselves as truth tellers, and the one thing they all had in common was the fact that they were actually less interested in telling you the truth than in hurting you as badly as they possibly could. "I'm not trying to hurt you," the saint replied. "I just want you to become yourself." That's the issue, John, that I'm somehow not myself? Not yourself in full, Rachel. Myself in full. I'm not even sure I know what that means. Of course you do. This full self you're advocating, do lots of people achieve it? You need to tell me, because it feels to me you're asking for more than most people can attain. I'm not talking about most people. I'm talking about you. John the Baptist, she thought. You know what you can do for me right about now? You can shut the up. She saw those deep, liquid, loving eyes burning at her. "I can be silent," he said, "but the question remains." Rachel Steinberg suffered from a not uncommon affliction. The thing that she actually loved, painting, was a thing for which, as it turned out, she had no actual talent. And the thing at which she was something of a virtuoso, academic writing and critical theory, was the thing she loathed. And so success had come to her, as it comes to so many people, not by doing the things she loved, which she did ineptly, but by doing the things she hated, at which she was a genius. This, sadly, had turned out to be the case in her love life as well. There had really only been two men in her life, Quentin and Backflip Bob, and her passion and her talent for these two loves had mirrored the same heartbreaking mismatch she'd experienced in her professional life. She'd adored Quentin, poor, doomed Quentin, just as she'd adored being a painter. But outside of the adoration itself, every aspect of this one great love of hers had been a disaster, ending in a collection of ugly canvases, ending in a suicide. Now she walked through the museum toward the Impressionists. "You know what you never told me, John the Bee? You never told me that the one whose coming you foretold would also turn out to be a man whose love I could not keep." There was a time when all of this had made her angry, that the love she wanted she had lost, and the love she could have kept was the one with Backflip Bob was the one she did not desire. She kept her eyes open in the years after she and Bob broke up on the off chance that there was a third love waiting for her. Who knew? It was possible that the one whose coming had been foretold had, even now, not yet arrived. But so what, Rachel thought? If the love of her life arrived now, it would still be too goddamn late. 57 was not ancient, but it was old enough for her to have settled into a life that revolved around academic research, around the Times crossword, around her old dog. Uptown Spinsterville, she thought. The likelihood that her life would alter much from what it had become was pretty small. From here on out, what she had to look forward to was mostly diminishment. Now and again, she'd make eye contact with someone, a young man in a museum, a stranger at a conference, and wonder whether this was the person she was still supposed to be waiting for. She read them all like clues leading toward her real life, a life that after all this time still felt to her as if it had not yet begun. She stopped in her tracks. Before her, taking up an entire wall, was Cézanne's The Large Bathers. She sighed. Perfect, she thought. Now this day is complete. "Tell me what you see," said John the Bee. "What do I see? They've changed," she thought. "Even these big bathers of Cézanne are not what they once were to me when I was young." It's not the bathers that have changed, Rachel Steinberg. "Oh, John, when I was young, I thought these enormous women were eternal, the embodiment of the feminine sublime. And now? Now I see them for what they are. Which is? There's nothing eternal about any of us anymore. Rachel, John said, looking at her with his sweet, forgiving eyes, his hand on his heart, the other one pointing toward the heavens. We are here for more than this. More? Rachel said out loud, angrily. She stamped her foot. What more? What more exactly? Tell me. Tell me. Tell me. Thanks.
Lovely.
Well, what do you think? It's 9 o'clock. We're gonna, I hope, at this time, turn to you. And it's for to hear some of the questions you might have for us. And traditionally at the Y, we solicit questions from the audience on index cards before the show, and those cards are brought backstage, and they take out all the pornographic ones and bring them to us on the stage, and I go through them. We decided not to do that. We figured that given the intimacy of this audience and the friendship between the two of us, we could just go to you. So I'm going to put my hand up to my eyes like this. Oh, look, there you are. Hi, everybody. So there's a question. If you ask, I'm going to stand up because I can. So I'll go to you, and then I'll repeat the question. Hi, first question.
My question is to Rick. Called Rick now. I last read Everybody's Fool, which I just absolutely loved, much more than I liked Nobody's Fool, I must say.
Oh.
However, I'm just wondering, when you went back to Sully and that whole environment and milieu of that story, did you do it so much because you wanted to, or did you feel that there was some pressure either from your editor, from your audience? What was your true reason to go back to those characters?
Well, it had.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. The question is, what was the impetus for going back to the world of North Bath and Sully and all of that? Was it something I wanted to do, or something my editor or agent, or was it art or commerce? I guess. No, I don't think that there was anybody after 23 years who was holding their breath for another fool book. So no, I wasn't. I don't ever get that kind of pressure from my editor or publisher anyway. My agent had been wanting another book about Sully since the first one was published, but he'd given up long ago. So no, there was nothing like that involved in it. I think it was, the whole book is about memory. It all takes place on Memorial Day weekend, and I don't remember why I started, why I thought it would be a good idea, because I had never revisited any of my characters again. I had no intention of writing a sequel. But once I started revisiting Sully, and once I realized that Officer Raymer, now Chief of Police Raymer, would be the main character, what I got out of it, for the most part, was resurrecting my father for a while, because Sully had been based on him. And so I got to, these books take me a while to write. So I had 5 or 6 more years of his company. And I discovered, much to my surprise and also delight, I would add, that while I was writing Nobody's Fool, I was then too, because my father had died before that book was written. When I wrote that book, I was channeling my father and enjoying his company. When it came time to write Everybody's Fool, I found that I was not only channeling my father and enjoying his company, I was also channeling Paul Newman and enjoying his company, because Paul had died in the interim. And as a matter of fact, this book is really about those people who have left us, who are not gone as long as we're alive. And so this book was a lot of fun, going back to North Bath, but it was also going back to Philip Seymour Hoffman, who had in a small role played Officer Raymer in the first movie, and Jessica Tandy and just giving those people some, those people giving me some more of their friendship.
Was it also visiting your own younger self too? Because you wrote that book when you were plus or minus 40, right?
Yeah, and that's what to go back to that to your reading that's the end of which is so moving when John the Bee says, so what has changed in those paintings, and he tells her no, it's that she's the one who has changed, and people have remarked that Everybody's Fool is a much darker book than Nobody's Fool. I mean, there are serpents in this book. There are snakes. There are snakes in the garden in this book where there weren't in Nobody's Fool, and the reason that it's darker is that those 23 years that have elapsed since between the first book and the second book. All of those have landed on the author. If you have any doubt about that, check the author photo on the back of Nobody's Fool, and then have a look at the one on the back of Everybody's.
Let's see another one. How about right here?
Can you each speak a little bit about writing, how much time you spend writing every day, the craft part? I'm starting on my first book. And
Oh, great.
tearing myself apart. I'm not disciplined enough.
I'll bet you're going to get the same answer from both of us, but why don't you, the question is about the not so much the art of writing, but the practice of writing, and how we go about our work. I'll go first, and you tell me whether you have a different answer. Yeah. So for me, it really is a practice, and if I'm working on a project, if I can get an hour and a half to 2 hours at the keyboard, and preferably in the morning. There's something about my brain fresh from sleep. I usually have a quota or a goal, and if I'm working on a project, it's, if I can get 1,500 words which is, 3 to 5 pages. That's on one day. That's good. And when I was young, I used to I would write all day. And in some ways, I think writing too much, at least for me, was not good because I would get sloppy. But for me, I guess the two things are: one, try to write every day, and to write if you can, even at the same time. But always to do it. And if you can, weekends too. And the other thing is that not to worry too much about your first draft, because you're gonna throw it away. And I've seen so many writers, both young and older, tear their hair out over that first chapter. Well, it's like, why would you worry? You're never going to keep that chapter. Your first chapter is usually the last thing you're gonna do. So most good writing, I think, takes place at the third and fourth draft stage, and but the trick is to make yourself do that editing, to have it. This is just kind of what you do. If you have writer's block, lower your standards. I mean, that's kind of a joke, but you shouldn't be
and kind of not.
Yeah, you should never be stuck because you don't think your work is good enough. Well, of course, especially at the first draft stage, it's easier to go from something that's bad to something that's good than it is to go from nothing to something. So you can't do the second draft until you have a crappy first draft in front of you. So just get in there. So how'd I do?
I am going to agree. I am going to agree with all of that, and add only that you say that you lack discipline. There are a couple of things that I would add to that. If you think you lack discipline, sometimes a lack of discipline can really be anxiety manifesting itself in some way. If you're you say you're working on your first novel, I think novels are almost impossible to think about as a whole because they'll make you crazy. What you have to be thinking about is the 2 pages or the 3 pages that you're going to get today. When you try to think about the whole thing, you begin to realize how big it is and how small you are, and you need to turn the tables on that a little bit. So if you think you lack discipline, try not thinking about the whole project, but only the small bite that you're going to take today. So small bite, chew thoroughly, swallow, repeat, is what you're after.
Yeah, I heard, is it Dr. O? Someone has a wonderful quote about writing a novel is kind of like driving home at night. You can only see as far ahead as your headlights, but if you keep driving, you can make the whole journey that way.
Got a couple of hands up over here.
Okay. We'll pick on one of them, Russo. The one that's up, that's still up, that one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi.
And then we'll come back to you, man.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I should start by saying I'm from Camden, Maine, the road to nowhere.
Oh, how about that?
Hi.
And so as someone who grew up there, I feel like I am increasingly aware of the problematic relationship between masculinity and vulnerability. As I see it, it's something that I think sort of seeps through subtly in your writing, and I'm wondering if this is something that you're consciously problematizing or criticizing, or if you just feel like by the nature of studying these characters, it comes through in your writing anyway.
All right, let's see if I can repeat that so that everybody knows. So the question then has to do with the friction between masculinity and vulnerability. I think that's a lot of that is just played out as some of the forces that have been present in my own life since I was young. Some of which I've already touched on a little bit in terms of my parents splitting up and my father being absent a lot, and so my following him in my fiction was probably an attempt to understand him, but also an attempt to understand what it is to be a man. But also the other singular force in my young life was that the town that I grew up in was one in which, I mean, this is something we're talking about an awful lot now as a result of jobs being lost and work being lost in the United States and going elsewhere, and having a lot of people wishing that, the steel industry was going to come back or the coal industry was going to come back. All of this happened in Gloversville, where I grew up, back in the 50s. So it really was kind of the canary in the coal mine, and already you were seeing in the streets of the town where I grew up men with nothing to do, men who were part of the social fabric, who kind of understood where they were in terms of their own manhood, what they were like as fathers to their children, husbands to their wives, and as they began to see that they were going to be sitting idle for much of their lives. You could see the fabric begin to rend itself and to find men wondering what it is to be a man in such a place and in such times. And as a result of watching men like that, seeing how vulnerable they were, the world was telling them how vulnerable they were. But part of what they were doing, of course, was denying that vulnerability and refusing to admit to it. So I think that those are the reasons that I come back to these things. The reasons that writers continually come back to certain subjects and certain metaphors probably has something to do with forces early in their lives. Dickens, as a young boy, was kind of sold off by when his father went to debtor's prison, or shortly thereafter, was kind of almost sold off to a blacking factory where he did this horrible work, and he felt like an orphan. And you read Dickens' books, one after another has an orphan in it. Well, why? Well, it's because despite the fact that he had parents, he felt like an orphan through much of his young life. And most of us who we're talking about Jenny's, some of Jenny's central metaphors in her book, that's something that fascinates me. Because I see it in my own life, but we're always interested in how it plays out in other people's lives, what their central metaphors are, what the subject that they can't let go of is.
Great question. Maybe one more? Oh, we were going to do the
Yes,
yes,
yes, ma'am.
Same
Hi.
place.
As you were describing And I wonder, it's through both of your writing, do you find that an overwhelm in you, when, after you've written a book, during the writing of your books?
I mean, it's the reason. It's the reason I write. I mean, I think one of the great misconceptions about writers and their work is that many people think that writers write books in order to tell all of you what we think. And I think that the exact opposite of that is true. We don't write to tell you what we know. We write in the hopes of discovering what we know best and what we know deepest. And well, I'll just let my voice fall there. Yeah, that's what you're looking for, and it's also the reason that you can come up with 6, 8, 10, 12 characters in a novel, and they all are related to you in some way, and you find that why the actor finds the one thing that he can connect to in order to play that character. That's the purpose, I think, in starting a new book. It's not about what we know. It's about what we don't know, and we hope to find out.
And that goes back to the question about that the audience member asked about process in writing. That I think another way we get writer's block is that we don't have an answer. We think we need to know the answers to the questions before we can write the book. I think a lot of writers, or some, especially younger writers, feel that they have to do an outline of the whole book. They have to know every single thing that's going to happen. And I think if you do that, in some ways, you take away almost the whole point of writing the book, because you need to write the book to find out the truth. And the great thing about writing a novel is that all these truths are revealed to you, and they're revealed to you through the characters, whom you kind of have to trust to lead you through the darkness. And sometimes the characters make a wrong turn. Sometimes they do the wrong thing, and you're on page 200, and you realize that back on page 120, when everybody got in the car and started driving around in the car, they should have stayed home. And so you need to go back. You need to go back to page 120, and you just, when someone says, let's all get in the car, you need to, save what you take out, but then another character is going to say, actually, no, I think we should all go to sleep. It sounds almost like witchcraft, and it's one of the eerie things about writing, because you really are involved in a journey to understand the self. I think I certainly came to understand not only what I'd been through, but also what I'd put my friends through when I wrote my memoir, She's Not There, in a way that I hadn't understood. There's one chapter late in the day, late in that book, when I had a whole chapter where I would just kind of describe what was going on from my wife's point of view. And it was, shall we say, somewhat less celebratory than what was going on from the chapters that focused on me. But I keep thinking about as we keep talking is that the differences between who we are as writers. When you wrote Nobody's Fool and Everybody's Fool, the way we change over time has to do with everything that's happened to us, but it also has to do just with the differences between an older person and a younger person. So people often ask me if my voice has changed now as a woman writer, and in some ways it has, I guess, but in a lot of ways no. And the ways that it has changed, I think, have less to do with going from male to female and more to do with going from 30 to 58.
Right.
In fact,
when there are five things happening at once, it's hard to focus on the one, isn't it? when you change genders, you're getting older. You have more money now, or less money now, or you have all of these, and your children are growing up. All of these things are happening, and then you look for a cause. Well, they're kind of all causes, aren't they?
Well, I began this evening by quoting in passing that line from Simon and Garfunkel's Bookends. the two old friends sitting like on the park bench like bookends. There's also a line from The Boxer, which I think is actually not in the version that they play on the radio, but I've heard performed live. And Paul Simon sings, what is it? The years are rolling by me, they're rocking by the lee. I'm older than I once was, but younger than I'll be. That's not unusual. Isn't it strange? After changes, we are more or less the same.
Yeah.
So I look at my Rick Russo on the chorus later. These two old friends, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.